All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is May Whiting, and I am the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. We are so excited you've joined us for the release of Alabama Possible's 2022 Barriers to Prosperity data resources. Now, many of you might be familiar with the data resources we're about to discuss, but if you're new to our work, this is an annual project we do. And in this webinar, we'll be highlighting some of the key findings from this year's edition of the datasheet. We'll also take a look at some of the resources that complement our datasheet, including our interactive data dashboard, our 2 discussion guides, and our toolkit. After we review those resources, we're excited to have a discussion about how we define, measure, and understand poverty. So the goal of that discussion is to provide a little context into the numbers that we see on the data sheet. And our goal is also to think about the way the numbers on the data sheet are quite limited in what they can tell us, both about the extent and scope of this phenomenon that we name poverty. So we'll conclude by thinking about the ways we can improve our understanding of financial hardship and hopefully, kind of by extension, improve our advocacy as well. So we're grateful to be joined today by Carol Gundlach, Senior Policy Analyst at Alabama Arise, to provide perspective on the way poverty as a concept, as something we attempt to measure, is really operationalized in her work. So she'll provide a view into the ways our conceptions of poverty kind of directly impact the way Alabama Arise works, and they advocate for public policies that really aim to improve the lives of Alabamians. So a few housekeeping notes before we get into it. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AlabamaPossible. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions using the Zoom chat feature. We'll answer those towards the end of our time together. You can stay up to date on our work by following us on social media. So you can find us at Alabama Possible. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So before we dive into the data today, I want to talk about how our data sheet is created. So every year we utilize national and state data sets to report on all kinds of barriers to prosperity. And we really want to recognize that so many of these barriers intersect with each other. So we feature all kinds of measures, such as rates of poverty, food security, educational attainment, employment, and health insurance coverage. And within those measures, we highlight some pretty stark disparities across different populations, across geographies. And we really want this project to allow people to both zoom in and zoom out. For example, we want you to be able to look at specific counties as well as the state as a whole. So that just gives a little background into our creation of the data sheet. So in order to summarize some of this year's key findings, we'd like to note that this year, Alabama is the 6th poorest state in the country. That's according to Census Bureau data. So Alabama has more than 714,000 people living below the federal poverty line. That figure includes 222,000 of Alabama's children. And poverty is definitely more concentrated in some regions of our state. So as you can see here, 7 counties in Alabama have a poverty rate higher than 25%. Only 2 counties in our entire state have a poverty rate under 10%.
So while poverty in Alabama has actually decreased over the last several years, the state's poverty rate is still much higher than the national rate. As you can see on this slide, um, the national poverty rate is 11.9% compared to Alabama's poverty rate of 14.9%. And then in terms of the child poverty rate, the US rate is 15.7%, while Alabama's child poverty rate is at 20.9%. Another way to look at financial security is to highlight income disparities, and the national median household income is $67,340, while Alabama's median household income is more than $13,000 less than that at $53,958. So we already mentioned some kind of disparities across counties, and we also see disparities across race and ethnicity. So this right here on the slide is looking at the three largest racial and ethnic groups in our state. We see the poverty rates across these three groups are very different. So the poverty rate of Black or African American Alabamians is 25.6% in that teal bar, compared to a poverty rate of 29.2% for Hispanic or Latino folks in Alabama. And that's that dark blue bar. And that's compared to a poverty rate of 11.2% for white Alabamians in that very light blue bar. Similarly, median household incomes for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino individuals in our state are far lower than the median household income for white Alabamians. And so if we were just to look at, our statewide poverty rate alone without further disaggregating it, we would really be missing all of these disparities that we just showed on our screen. So we're trying to break down the data as much as possible so that we can be better advocates in closing equity gaps. So I want to take a look at the data sheet as well as some of the other resources. All of these resources can be accessed or downloaded at alabamapossible.org/datasheet. All right, so here we are on our landing page for all of our Barriers to Prosperity data resources. And as you navigate this page, you can click on any of the links to access whichever resource you'd like. So we have our data sheet, our dashboard, our toolkit, and our additional resources, which will include our discussion guides that we're going to talk about today. So I am going to start off with our data sheet. So I want to start off by looking at the US map. I'll zoom in a little bit for you here. So the maps allow you to visualize and compare poverty rates of different geographic regions. So the darker the shading of the county or the state, the higher the poverty rate. So on the US map on this first page, you can see that Alabama is one of 7 states in the country with a poverty rate greater than or equal to 14.9%. So that darker green blue shading that you see mostly in the Southeast. And to kind of give you an idea of where these rates are coming from to even make these states a certain shade, we can look at our poverty thresholds all the way to the right. And we'll discuss these thresholds in more detail in the next part of the presentation. But as you can see, for a single individual, the federal poverty threshold is $13,171. For a family of 4, the federal poverty threshold is $26,496. I'm sure it's obvious when you hear this number that this threshold right here, it really doesn't give us an accurate depiction of what it takes to support a family of that size. we obviously know that the thresholds don't really capture the scope of hardship that Alabamians face. But this federal measure does allow us to make comparisons across state, even if the measure is pretty limited in what it captures. So again, we'll talk more about these limitations after we review all of our data resources. So I want to move to the line graph. And as we noticed on the United States map, Alabama has quite a high poverty rate compared to the rest of the country. While that is certainly the case, Alabama has seen a decrease in its poverty rate over the last several years. Our state's poverty rate, of course, is still much higher than the national poverty rate. And then our median household income is much lower than the national median household income. And then if we look more closely at our state map, we can see that certain counties are faring worse than others. Like I mentioned, we see 7 counties in Alabama have a poverty rate higher than 25%. 2 of those counties even have poverty rates of 30% or higher. So, that means close to 1/3 of the county's residents are living below the poverty line. Again, the disparities across race and ethnicity that we mentioned can be seen in the middle of page 1. So we see that both for poverty rates and median household income, they are quite different across these 3 races and ethnicities. So again, that's our first page. We're really looking at a zoomed out overview, and we're seeing these huge disparities both across different counties in our state and also across different populations in our state. So on page 2 of the data sheet, which this is a really zoomed out view, you can probably hardly see anything right here. But this is where we look at data for all 67 counties and the state as a whole, as well as the United States. So we have this broken up into big categories at the top, starting with poverty rate by demographic. So you can look at several different populations under that, and we think that's especially useful for breaking down the data. In the next section, we see rates of food insecurity as measured by Feeding America. And we also see rates of SNAP recipients or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Next, we see education measures. We have continued to disaggregate educational attainment by sex. At this time, the American Community Survey does only capture a respondent's sex along a binary and does not capture gender identity. So this is what we're working with for the time being. But you can see, for instance, the percentage of men who are high school graduates or higher compared to the percentage of women who are high school graduates or higher. And that disaggregation really isn't useful on the state level, but it becomes more and more useful at the county level. So that could be a good measure for, say, county school districts. We also have under education college enrollment rates, including both 2-year and 4-year enrollment rates. As you can see in Alabama, we have a higher rate of enrollment in 2-year institutions than the national rate. And then we have a lower rate of enrollment in 4-year institutions than the national enrollment rate. Overall, we have a lower total enrollment rate in Alabama compared to the nation. I think this really highlights the need for our Alabama Goes to College programming, both in the direct support that we provide to schools and in the college affordability advocacy that we do. Then we highlight employment measures, including workforce participation rates for those 16 and older, and then median household income. Lastly, we show the percentage of individuals who are 19 to 64 years old who are without health insurance. So we show here the huge role that employment plays and whether or not people have health insurance coverage. Scrolling down to the very bottom of our second page, you'll see here we define some key terms and then we cite all of the sources used to compile the data sheet. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can take a note because I want you to notice the year of each of the data sources. This year's edition of the data sheet uses the most recent data available, most of which is from 2020. Most of the current survey data that we're using will not be capturing the full impact of the pandemic, so I wanted to highlight that. The data might only, in fact, partially reflect the pandemic's impact, and that's because a lot of what the data sheet is pulling from is the American Community Survey 5-year estimates. So those 5-year estimates will reflect 60 months of collected data. So that would include many pre-pandemic months. So again, that is our 2-page data sheet. We're really trying to include measures that give a fuller picture of barriers that Alabamians face. And then we have an interactive version of everything you've seen here. And then it also includes a few more data points if you want to dive even deeper into the data. So let's head on over to our dashboard. Give it a little refresh. So when you first access the dashboard, you'll be on the first tab, Poverty by State. Here you can click any state on the map. So let's scroll. Oh, zoomed way too far in. So we'll click right here, South Dakota. And when we click South Dakota, we see the overall poverty rate, the child poverty rate, and median household income. So again, you can click any state on the map to get those 3 measures. You can also go to the second tab, which is Poverty by County. And here you'll have a map of Alabama. So you can click anywhere on the map. I'll click Perry County. And this will give you a detailed look at the population, the poverty rates, food security, county education, county employment, and county health insurance. So if when we were looking at the 2-page data sheet, that seemed wholly overwhelming to see all 67 counties at once, then I highly recommend going to our dashboard so you can kind of filter the data exactly as you would like to see it. You can also filter the data on our third tab, which is our county data table. So we'll click that. This is where you can compare counties of interest. So before I show you how to filter, I just want to point out there will be some blanks in the table, and this is simply because that particular population is not represented in that county. So just be aware of that. And so you can go to the side and select the counties that you'd like to compare by first deselecting all and then selecting your counties of interest. So I'll select 3 here. So those will populate in the data table, and then I can also sort the information by the columns at the top. So if you click on any column, you can then sort in ascending or descending order by clicking one of those buttons. So here I'm comparing these 3 counties by the Hispanic or Latino poverty rate. Again, I would recommend coming to the dashboard if you're looking for data for a specific county or a set of counties, since you can really easily filter out the data that you don't need. And this just makes the data a little more engaging, and we would recommend using it even in a classroom setting. So because of that, I would like to now turn to our discussion guides that we make available to really complement both the data sheet and the dashboard. So our first discussion guide is the Educator's Guide. And again, all of this can be found at alabamapossible.org/datasheet. The purpose of this guide is to incorporate the data sheet into learning activities in the classroom. It is primarily meant for secondary and post-secondary age students. So one section of the guide is going to be a bunch of different discussion questions. These will do a really great job at contextualizing all of the data because the questions are going to encourage students to think about all of the different factors that contribute to financial hardship. An important piece of this reflection will be having students consider the impact of systems, of institutions, and policies on communities. So after the discussion questions, it moves to this community assessment worksheet. So this gets students to really put poverty into their local context. So they'll look at the data for their home community. And then it kind of gets them to consider how these findings can be translated into action outside of the classroom. So first they find all the data points for their community, and then they think about how they could advocate for policy change based on the data they've reviewed. Lastly, we have an assignment. It's an infographic activity where students get to create a visual representation of poverty for the purpose of kind of strengthening their communication around all of these issues and ultimately empowering them to be able to build awareness of the issues and advocate for positive change. So this is our education guide. And now I'll move over to a different discussion guide. It is just a 2-pager, but this can be used really in any context, not just the classroom. With this 2-page guide, we're hoping that it inspires community discussions where people can describe the data they're seeing, interpret the data based on their real world living conditions, and then kind of critically reflect on everything they've reviewed. So we think this guide is important because, of course, there's a lot we can glean from the data, but there's so much history and context behind those numbers that we think the reflection and discussion components are so vital to this work. So that kind of leads into our final resource that we have not been able to display in a webinar before, but it is our Breaking Barriers to Prosperity Toolkit. So this toolkit is really for communities that want to get involved in kind of a focused project that includes 3 different components, and I'll quickly go over those components. The first is going to be community discussions. These are meant to promote awareness and deliberation among a convened group. And again, we think that's important because when these discussions are localized, you're really fostering shared understanding so that people can work together. The second component are the virtual poverty simulations. Those are striving to build empathy by having participants experience some of the challenges that under-resourced families face over kind of the duration of a simulated month. And then the third component is going to move deliberation and empathy building into action. So this includes our Breaking Barriers Forum. And in that forum, participants have an opportunity to ask, what do we want to do to address the issues? And then what is the way forward? So the goal of that kind of final action piece is to identify ideas for individual and community-based action. So I wanted to note the Alabama Possible team is in the process of working with groups in multiple counties to engage in these components in the toolkit. And yeah, we're really excited to continue watching that work unfold. So all of these resources can be found at alabamapossible.org/datasheet. And for many of them, they can be downloaded and then printed and used in whatever way you see fit. In an effort to kind of further our understanding of everything we just looked at on the data sheet, really everything we looked at in terms of the poverty rates that we saw and the poverty thresholds that we saw on page 1 of the data sheet. We want to kind of dive into something that we haven't had a chance to do before, which is give even more context to those numbers. So we'll more closely examine how poverty is defined and measured. So we talk about poverty rates all the time, but what even is poverty? How are we measuring it? And really, how do those measures impact our understanding and our experiences of poverty? So we're starting with this foundational question: what is poverty? That, of course, isn't an easy question to answer. Poverty is both inconsistently defined and socially constructed. So we often think of poverty in terms of physical need or material lack. One way to think about it might be lack of income that results in an inability to meet basic needs like food and shelter. I think a lot of people think about poverty in this way, but there's other ways of looking at it. We could also look at a societal definition of poverty. So we could define poverty as a lack of opportunity and inclusion. This definition is more concerned kind of with the relational aspect of poverty. So it might ask if a person is socially excluded. And what we mean by that is maybe there are limits on their ability to consume, to produce, to engage, or to interact within the society in which they live. And then this view of poverty is going a little bit further than the physical needs definition, and it thinks about our membership within a social group. But we could think of a definition of poverty and the way that we define it as having political implications. So our idea of poverty can certainly determine how we respond to it, how we expect institutions like the government to address it. And the definition of poverty is political in nature because, to some extent, it's reflecting our beliefs and our ideology. So, for instance, our definition, say our definition implies that poverty is the result of individual behavior. We might respond to poverty differently that way than if our definition implies that poverty is the product of systems that are kind of perpetuating inequality. So those different ways of viewing poverty really highlight the point that poverty is socially constructed. It's context dependent. And what I mean by that is that certain assumptions are made about poverty, and those assumptions vary across place and group. Our narratives around poverty are shaped by the media, academia, and politicians. So it's really important to consider, what are the implications of our assumptions about poverty? What meaning are we assigning to poverty, whether implicitly or explicitly when we define it? And then how might our definition of poverty contribute to shame or stigma? So lots of questions to ask ourselves. We might also ask, what value judgments are we making? For example, we might notice that the way we talk about poverty contributes to this idea of deserving versus undeserving. So as we're asking the question, what is poverty? We should also consider the power of language as we define the term. So you can see some of the words that we use to describe poverty kind of touch on the way that poverty is differently defined. For instance, When we say low income, we might get at the heart of the physical definition of poverty. When we use words like under-resourced, we might be leaning a little bit more towards the societal definition. And when we talk about marginalized communities, we might be getting more towards the heart of the political definition of poverty. So just kind of wanted to start off with that. Our definitions, of course, will impact how we measure the phenomenon. So let's take a quick look at the design history of the official US poverty measure. So the measure we use in the United States was established in the 1960s to assess the relative risks of low economic status. And the measure we used was developed by Molly Orshansky, and it defined poverty as a lack of income. So we're really using a material or physical definition here. The official poverty definition uses money income before taxes, so it does not include non-cash benefits, things like public housing benefits, food stamps, things along those lines. And when we say money income, we mean things like wages and earnings, interest income, and the like. And it's going to compare that pre-tax money income of an individual or of a family to these thresholds that vary based on family size and composition. So you can see that on the right hand of the screen. So for example, for a family of three, their income before taxes must be below $20,591 for them to be considered in poverty. Now, these thresholds were based on the cost of an economy food plan, and it was based on 1955 data that showed that families of three or more spent 1/3 of their after-tax income on food. And so that poverty measure multiplied the cost of the food plan by 3, and that's how we get the thresholds that we're using today. So you can understand how this might not have aged well, and that's kind of what we're getting at in the next part of this. So these rates have really received very little revision other than to account for inflation, and that's using the Consumer Price Index. So little revision to these measures despite a lot of changes in our standard of living and in the composition of our spending. So over the years, the poverty line really has lost all connection with current consumption patterns of the average family. And to kind of highlight this, Orshansky's measure, it once equaled 1/2 of median income. Now that measure only equals about 1/3 of median income. In as early as 1995, the National Research Council and poverty researchers broadly concluded that the US measure is outdated, should not be retained. However, we're still using it. The measure was originally meant to be a research tool, but even Molly Orshansky highlighted that it would be minimizing poverty. So as early as its inception, we knew that this measure would be kind of an adequate way of capturing the scope and the extent of financial hardship. And it's the measure's ability to tell us about the actual experience of poverty has kind of further eroded over time. And that's the result of our changes in our spending habits and in our changes to standard of living. So this is kind of a constant point that we make when we're reviewing our data sheet each year. We know the limitations of the poverty measure, and that's why we also include all other kinds of measures to kind of supplement it. So we look at things like food security and educational attainment to really further our understanding. So I'm going to dive into the limitations of the measure a bit more. We already heard some of the criticisms around its original design, but I want to elaborate on its limitations. So starting off with conception of income. Now, The thresholds are based on pre-tax money income. And so that is going to kind of inadequately represent the resources that families and individuals have available for consumption. So pre-tax money income is not going to account for critical expenses families have, like shelter and tax liabilities, childcare, and out-of-pocket medical expenses. But if we were to subtract these expenses, we would have a better idea of what families actually have available to use towards resources. Now, by using pre-tax income, we're also not accounting for those non-cash benefits like food stamps and public health insurance. And by not adding those in-kind benefits, the official measure does not really gauge the effect of policy initiatives. So if we're not counting the food stamps when we're measuring poverty, we're not seeing, oh, are food stamps actually supporting families in a way that lifts them out of poverty? So by not including in-kind cash benefits, we're not really seeing the effects of certain social policies. Another limitation is the poverty measure's conception of family. So the thresholds are going to evaluate resource pooling by defining the family unit as just those who are related by blood or marriage in the household. So that's not going to consider, other folks who live in the house and might also be sharing resources. Another limitation is the arbitrary threshold cutoffs. So cutoffs, of course, are just going to draw a line that establishes this binary of poor and non-poor. And that's really overlooking the fact that folks above and below the poverty line might be experiencing some of the same hardships. For example, a three-person household that makes $20,590 and then a three-person household that makes $20,595, there's just a $5 difference there. But for the purposes of categorizing poverty, one household is considered in poverty while another household is considered above the poverty line. And that's regardless of the fact that these households are likely experiencing similar hardships. Another really big limitation is that despite large differences in cost of living based on your geographic region, the current measure applies the same thresholds to every household across the nation. So we obviously know, it costs way more to live in San Francisco than it does to live in Mobile, but that same poverty line is applied to residents in both places. One limitation is that the official poverty measure kind of uses an absolute versus a relative measure. Absolute measures of poverty are ones that are based on a uniform set of needs. It's independent of time or place. And so the official US poverty measure is considered absolute. It's applying that certain threshold without really considering the way our needs evolve and change over time. Relative measures of poverty, on the other hand, do a better job of gauging poverty because relative measures are going to be grounded in economic, social, historical context. So they're thinking about the contextual norms of need. And I'll give one example to highlight this. So an example of a relative measure would be comparing someone's income to 50% of the median income of that country. So for a family of three, if we were to use a relative measure of poverty, that might put the poverty threshold well above $30,000 instead of the $20,591 that the official measure currently uses. So that covers absolute versus relative. Another limitation is that when we're looking at the official measure, we're really only looking at a snapshot of someone's life. What was your income at this one point in time? And what we know about a point in time analysis is that it is going to obscure the volatility of income that happens over the course of the life. It's going to also obscure how spending habits might change over the course of a life. And it's true in our country that folks move in and out of poverty way more frequently than our official measure is going to reveal. So it's going to mask that Americans are poor over the course of their life, and our official measure is only getting that one snapshot each year. So these are the limitations of the current measure. I cover these to highlight that the official measure really doesn't capture the dimensions of hardship and deprivation. And even as the Census Bureau says, it's really only meant to be a statistical yardstick of sorts. So we want to kind of close out our time in terms of this review with how can we improve our measurement. There are lots of different ways that we can improve our understanding of poverty. The first is what we've already alluded to is it's important to count in-kind benefits such as food and housing assistance, as well as safety net benefits like the earned income tax credit. If we are to account for these benefits in an individual or family's income, then we're better able to gauge the actual resources that are available to an individual or family. So this will help us to see how social policies are working to support people, and we highly encourage that these be factored into our measurement. So many of you might have heard of the supplemental poverty measure, or the SPM. I think it was in 2011 that a report was released first using this measure, and it actually accounts for government programs that are excluded from the official poverty measure. So here, the supplemental poverty measure is kind of correcting that conception of income that we talked about. Another way to improve our understanding is to think about family expenditures in a different way. The supplemental poverty measure is going to actually subtract out necessary expenditures, so things we all can't avoid, taxes, we can't avoid them. So we have to pay the taxes. That money is not available to us to be able to go out and consume. So we're going to subtract things like taxes, childcare expenses, out-of-pocket medical expenses to better reflect the resources a family might actually have once we take out those expenses. So the supplemental poverty measure will better reflect those expenses, and it also in turn kind of corrects the official poverty measure's conception of family. So we talked about the official measure using this definition of family as those in the household who are related by blood or marriage. But the supplemental poverty measure actually adds folks to that picture. So it adds any co-resident unrelated children. It also adds foster children and unmarried partners or relatives. So that just gives us a better idea of the group of people who are living together and sharing resources. The SPM also adjusts the thresholds based on recent expenditure data. So we talked about the official measure being based on that economy food plan from the 1950s. The SPM is looking at recent expenditure data to better capture how folks in this country are consuming and spending their money. It's also this SPM, it's taking into account geographic differences in the cost of living. So it's better capturing these current norms of need. And then two other things that we really want to factor into our understanding of poverty are life cycle dynamics and intergenerational dynamics. So we talked about how the poverty measure is just a snapshot. It's failing to account for kind of the economic changes that accompany certain stages of our lives. So, with a life cycle view of poverty, we're considering what is contributing to our movement in and out of poverty during certain life stages. And that's no simple task, but it is important to consider these dynamics that folks are facing over the course of their life. Similarly, with intergenerational dynamics of poverty, it's important to consider what factors affect the inheritance of advantage or disadvantage. So we know that the transmission of disadvantage is more likely in countries with higher levels of income and wealth inequality. That inequality is essentially limiting opportunity that supports mobility. So we want to think about how poverty is being inherited and the intergenerational dynamics of it. And both life cycle and intergenerational dynamics can be used to inform social policies that are trying to kind of reduce the persistence of those. One example for life cycle dynamics, state pensions and old age health insurance programs, some of those might alleviate the hardships that are faced by elderly populations. So we're thinking about folks who are moving out of employment, no longer receiving steady wages, and we're addressing that life cycle dynamic by using social policies that specifically reach folks in that population. So I know that that was a lot. We're talking about the limitations of the poverty measure, as well as some new ways we can think about poverty and kind of improve our understanding of it. I would now like to turn it over to Carol Gundlach, again, Senior Policy Analyst at Alabama Rise, to provide her perspective on how these measures are being operationalized. So I'll turn it over to you, Carol.
Thank you, May. I want to really just state my agreement with May's comments about how important the formula by which we determine poverty is. We all know that the traditional poverty measure is badly outdated. It was outdated in 1995, which was, I was doing some quick calculation in my head. It was, I think, 27 years ago. We know it seriously undercalculates actual poverty in much of the United States. I also want to agree with her about the importance of the supplemental poverty measure, which is a somewhat better measure of poverty. It's not perfect, and it doesn't factor in all of the dynamics that we would like to see factored in, but it is a better one. And one of the reasons that we at Arise are particularly interested in this is there is a narrative out there that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. And I think many of you have heard this. You've seen it in op-eds. And in point of fact, it is not true. We fought a war on poverty. And while we didn't win the war on poverty, we made things a lot better for a lot of people. And you are hearing a number of politicians and kind of pundits arguing that we should not be trying to do things like increase the child tax credit because the earned income tax credit didn't fix poverty. Why would the child tax credit fix it? Well, we can, in point of fact, point to the supplemental poverty measure to say, yes, the TANF program, the SNAP program, the earned income tax credit, federally subsidized housing, federally available Medicare, or health services really made a difference in people's experience of poverty. And it's something we can build on. So I think it is important to think about the supplemental poverty measure when we're evaluating poverty. But I say that with one caveat, which is we don't want to do the alternative assessment that we fought a war on poverty and we won. because in point of fact, there are still a lot of low-income people in the state, however we measure it, and in the nation, however we measure poverty, we know that there are people still struggling. And so while the supplemental rate finds that poverty is lower, at the same time, the underlying definition of poverty that affects both the official rate and the supplemental rate are still very flawed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Alabama Arise uses measures of poverty in our work to both analyze and evaluate and develop policy options for the state of Alabama, and to advocate for policy options for the state. We don't officially compile and report census data because groups like Alabama Possible and Voices for Alabama's Children do such a wonderful job of doing exactly that work. There is no reason for us to duplicate the excellent work they're doing. But we are very active users of this data in the same way that I think Alabama Possible and other groups are active users of this data. And so our kind of go-to data when we are presented with a policy issue or an issue of need or an issue of what do we want about this, our go-to measures are a couple of places. One is the decennial census of every household in the US, which of course we all know just came out. There are some challenges. This particular year, that was a particularly challenging census for some very political reasons. And that's not usually the first place we will go. Usually the first place we're going to go is exactly where May was talking about, which is the American Community Survey of particularly their 5-year tables of poverty and economic issues, because those are more reliable than any snapshot in time, 1 year table, one year evaluation of what's going on in the country. We also rely really heavily on the more observed Census Bureau business and economic data, and on the census data of government expenditures, which is even probably more obscure. But in doing the census, they also look at how government is spending their money, both how state and local government spending their money, how much money into state and local governments, and what's going on in the business community. We also rely real heavily on the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which is very closely aligned and a lot of the time is merged with census data because BLS and the Census Bureau work very closely together. But sometimes BLS data is released as often as monthly. And so we all are used to the monthly unemployment benefits or unemployment rates. And so we can use BLS data in a much more time-sensitive way than census data. We also look real closely at program data that is reported by the states to federal agencies. I noticed a question in the chat about the relationship between poverty and the child welfare system. I think that's a really interesting question that I'd be really interested in going back and taking a look at. We know that there is a relationship between poverty and entrance into the child welfare system. The question of entrance into the child welfare system and subsequent poverty is, I think less research, but is really interesting. And one of the places we can get that data is every state agency that gets funding from the federal government reports a whole lot of data back to that federal agency. Most of that data is available on the agency's website. It includes a lot of demographic data as well as just, you know, kind of more straightforward participation data. And a number of agencies that work with Congress will do periodic reports to Congress based on that data, which are also tremendously helpful in interpreting kind of the way the federal government sees what's going on in the states. And then speaking to Ralph's question in the chat, we at Alabama Arise have during the pandemic paid very close attention to what is called the Census Household Pulse Survey. And that is a survey that the census does about every 2 or 3 weeks, more or less, where they ask a sample, and it's a small sample, and there are a lot of sampling errors with it. But they ask a sample of the population of the United States, how the pandemic has affected them and how the related recession and economic situation with the pandemic has affected them. Like I said, there are a lot of sampling issues with that, but it's been really, really helpful in looking at kind of real life in time effects of the pandemic. So how have we used this in our recent work? Well, a couple of years ago, we did what we called a Medicaid Matters report. And in that, we compared Alabama to other states in the country and to national trends in people's ability to access health care and what kind of health outcomes people were getting, were suffering by state. We could identify some specific policy recommendations to address those disparities where Alabama was doing less well than other states. That was heavily relying on census data and other data that was collected by like the Centers for Disease Control and, you know, some private foundations. But we were able to pull out from that data specific populations and specific types of workers that were disproportionately affected by the lack of access to health care and people who would benefit from Medicaid expansion, which was our advocacy goal. We've also undertaken a couple of targeted projects addressing specific communities in the state. Specifically, we are working with one community in Mobile to address hunger as a social determinant of health, working with the expanded, the Medicaid services programs in that area to try to get food prescriptions and referral to SNAP benefits for people in that community. And so to help inform our understanding of that community and to seek funding from a foundation to do this work, we looked at census block data for that community, which is really narrowing our census data way down to a tiny, tiny area, not even a county, but to a tiny community within that county, and to say, what are the demographics of this community? What's their SNAP utilization rate? What's the age rate? What are the health issues that this community is confronting? We recently, very recently, published a report, and any of you who are interns on this call, 2 of our wonderful social work interns researched and wrote this report on the need to expand public transportation in rural communities. excuse me, and they did their own survey of public transit programs, but they accompanied it with census data, including census data on how long the commute was for people living in that county to work. So they could say in Wilcox County, here's what services are available, but here's what services really need to be available according to the US Census and the commute time that it takes for people to get to work. We also have really looked at underutilization of programs, particularly programs that affect access to other services. So for example, and this is very weedy, we have noted that some counties in Alabama that we know intuitively are low-income counties have a much lower rate of participation in the community eligibility program to provide free, universal free meals for kids in school. And that's because they don't get reimbursed as much money as other counties to provide this service. So we said, why? You know, we know these are poor counties. Why? Well, it's because they have a low rate of SNAP participation, because that determines the rate by which they get reimbursed for free meals. So then the question was, why do some counties have lower rates of SNAP participation than others? So we really wanted to go in and look at the demographics of the population of the counties and the population of who receives SNAP in those counties compared to other counties in the state. And what we kind of pulled out of that was the counties that have the lowest rate of SNAP participation, therefore the lowest rates of universal free meals in schools, were counties that were disproportionately two things. One is just disproportionately white, one is disproportionately Hispanic. And so then the question is, how do we do outreach to those communities to up the rate of SNAP participation and also correspondingly uprate the access to universal free meals in schools? I want to point you, and again, particularly those of you who are interested in the pandemic issue, to a report that we did back in last February. So it's kind of at the height of the pandemic. It's called State of Work in Alabama. ARISE has done this report every year or so for quite a long time, where we look at the economic conditions of lower income Alabama workers. And historically, we've used BLS and census data to do this. We continue to use those, but we really wanted to zero in on the pandemic. So we really focused on the household pulse survey. And we looked at the impact of the pandemic on labor market participation, particularly for women and people of color. We looked at who were the frontline workers in Alabama, and this is BLS data. So who works in retail? Who works in healthcare? Who works in emergency services? Because those were what we were all calling our heroes, our frontline workers, and who are the people at the greatest risk from the pandemic. We looked at reporting data on unemployment compensation and at the problems in people being able to get unemployment compensation. Because again, these reports were being made to the federal government, so we could pull those reports. And we, at that time, examined, and we are continuing to look very closely at the impact of the pandemic on the housing crisis in Alabama. We can pull that data from the Household Pulse Survey. We can separate that out by people of color and by families with children, so we know who's at the greatest risk of eviction. And we compare that data, the data from the reports made by the Alabama Housing Finance Authority, which administers the federal housing relief money, to be able to evaluate the response in Alabama to, what we consider to be an eviction crisis, and to be able to draft policy recommendations for how we can address the longstanding impact of the pandemic and kind of chronic poverty on the housing needs for the people of the state. And so how we can also advocate for policies that will address those housing needs both in the short term and in the long term. So that's just a couple of examples. If any of you would like to give me a call or send me an email, I will have to put my email address in here or depend on May to share it. But we'd love to talk with you further, particularly any of those of you who are interested in delving more deeply into these issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Carol. So I think she did a wonderful job illustrating that they're using all kinds of data sets, both for reporting purposes, to build awareness, to target their outreach, especially for programs that are underutilized, and then also to build out these policy recommendations that will hopefully bring about positive change for Alabamians. So lots of great information in there. I know that we've run a little over on our time today, so I wanted to just briefly touch on some things that have been in the chat, and we will follow up with you by email for those who ask specific questions. But like I mentioned with this year's data sheet, it is largely using these 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey. Because of that, it's not showing a deep reflection of the pandemic. It is using 60 months of collected data. So we aren't really seeing the full impact of the pandemic on our 2022 data sheet. But like Carol mentioned, there is that great resource from the Census Bureau. It's the household pulse survey data that we linked in the chat. So if you're really looking for the impact of the pandemic, we would recommend going to that source. We will address all of the other questions via email, but I just wanted to go back and share our slides so that we can show you the link to all of these resources, and wanted to mention a few things. In our follow-up email, you'll have links directly to all of the resources we cover today, and you'll also see a link to a survey so that we can get your feedback on this webinar. If you are interested in learning more about the toolkit that we mentioned today, so kind of those 3 different components that communities can engage in, you can indicate your interest in that toolkit on the last part of our survey where it's free response, and you can type your name and your email and everything like that. So again, if you're interested in the toolkit, feel free to indicate that on the survey. I would now like to invite our program director, Manisha Mishra, to discuss another opportunity that's upcoming to be engaged in this work.
Thank you, May. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for attending the webinar, and hopefully you found ways you could use the findings from this data sheet to guide the invaluable work that you all do. Alabama Possible will host a panel discussion in the next month on ways that statewide and national practitioners use this data sheet to influence their work. We will keep you posted on the exact date once it's finalized. Now I'll hand it back to May. Thank you, May.
All right, thanks to everyone who's stuck around this long. We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you again, Carol, for sharing all of that wonderful information. We'll post a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and look at any of the information that we shared, but I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.